A royal guard stood alone in the archive room beneath Windsor Castle, holding a leather notebook he was ordered to destroy. His hands trembled as he opened it one final time. Inside were names, dates, arrival times, visitors who came through the private entrance at ours when the palace should have been silent. Some of the names made his blood run cold. He had written everything down, against protocol, against orders, because something felt dangerously wrong. Now, years later, those pages were the only proof of what he had witnessed. But proof of what, exactly? And what would happen if anyone discovered he had kept them? Asterisk, the guard's name was Thomas Hartley, and he had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades. He came from a military family where duty and silence were taught before he could read. His father had been a Coldstream Guard, his grandfather before him. Thomas wore the bearskin and red tunic with pride, standing motionless for hours outside Buckingham Palace while tourists took photographs. But the real work happened inside, away from the cameras. In 2011, Thomas was reassigned to a special detail at Windsor Castle. The assignment came without explanation, just a quiet conversation in a side office and new security clearance. He would be stationed at the East Terrace entrance, a private access point used by senior royals and their approved guests. It was considered a privileged position, a sign of trust. Thomas accepted without question. The first few months were unremarkable. He logged visitors during the day, checked credentials, and escorted guests to the appropriate wings. Everything was documented in the official registry. Evening shifts were usually quiet. The castle settled into stillness after dark, with only occasional staff movements or late meetings. Then the pattern changed. It started in late autumn. Thomas was on night duty when a black Range Rover arrived at the East Terrace entrance just after 2 in the morning. No advance notice had been given, which was unusual. The driver presented credentials identifying him as part of Prince Andrew's security detail. In the back seat sat a young woman, early 20s, blonde, wearing an expensive coat but looking uncomfortable. Thomas followed protocol. He radioed the main security desk and logged the arrival. The approval came back within minutes. He opened the gate and watched the vehicle proceed toward the private residence wing. The girl glanced at him as they passed, her expression unreadable. If you're finding this story as unsettling as Thomas did, subscribe now, because what he discovered next went far beyond a single strange visitor. 3 nights later, another vehicle arrived at the same hour. Different driver, different girl. This one looked younger, perhaps 19, with dark hair and a nervous smile. Again, the credentials checked out. Again, Thomas logged it and let them through. But this time, curiosity gnawed at him. He began paying closer attention to the pattern. The visits occurred roughly twice a week, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always to the same wing. The women were always young, always alone except for the driver, always listed as approved guests, with no further details. The official logs recorded only their arrival times and departure times. Nothing more. Thomas mentioned it casually to another guard during a shift change. The man's expression darkened immediately. "Don't ask questions about that entrance," he said quietly. "Just do your job and forget what you see." But Thomas couldn't forget. He had daughters. Seeing these young women arrive in the dead of night, seeing the way some of them looked frightened or too calm or drug-triggered, something protective in him, he started keeping his own notes, just names when he could catch them, physical descriptions, arrival times, vehicle details. He told himself it was extra diligence, in case something ever went wrong and there were questions. By December, his private notebook contained 17 entries. By February 31, the visits continued with mechanical regularity, a rotation of faces that sometimes repeated, sometimes didn't. None of the women ever stayed past dawn. Then one night, Thomas recognized someone climbing out of the car. Asterisk, her face had been all over the tabloids just months earlier. Virginia Roberts, the American girl photographed with Prince Andrew, his arm around her waist. The photo had sparked brief media attention before being dismissed and buried. Now, she was here, at 2:13 in the morning. Being escorted through the private entrance, Thomas felt ice spread through his chest. He logged her arrival with shaking hands, using only the initials VR. His personal notebook. She looked older than in the photograph, tired. She didn't look at him at all. He stood at his post for the next 4 hours, unable to shake the image. When dawn came and she left, driven away in the same black vehicle, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for years. He began documenting everything with obsessive detail. Not just names and times anymore, but descriptions of behavior. Snippets of overheard conversation. The condition the women appeared to be in when they left. Some departed, looking relieved, laughing with their drivers. Others looked shell-shocked, silent. One girl cried the entire way to the car. Thomas wanted to intervene, to ask if she was all right, but his training held him in place. Guards don't interfere. Guards don't question. Guards observe and obey. The weeks blurred together. Thomas requested a transfer twice and was denied both times without explanation. He began to suspect that his assignment to this particular post was deliberate, that he had been chosen specifically because of his flawless record of discretion. Perhaps they thought his military background would ensure his silence. They were almost right in April. A senior officer pulled Thomas aside after a shift. "You've been doing excellent work," the man said, his tone friendly, but his eyes cold. "Exemplary logs. Very thorough. But remember, what happens inside these walls stays inside these walls. The Official Secrets Act applies to everything you see. Everything." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Thomas nodded and said nothing. That night, he bought a fireproof safe and began keeping his notebook locked at home. He told his wife it contained financial documents. She didn't question him. Their marriage had already learned the boundaries of what could and couldn't be discussed about his work. The entries in his notebook grew darker. He started recognizing some of the drivers, memorizing license plates, noting which girls appeared multiple times. There were patterns within patterns. Some women came once and never returned. Others became regulars, arriving every 2 or 3 weeks with the mechanical predictability of a scheduled appointment. One name appeared in the official logs more frequently than others: Jeffrey Epstein. Thomas had never heard of him at the time. The credentials described him as a businessman and philanthropic, associate of the Duke of York. His arrivals were less secretive than the late-night visitors, usually occurring in early evening. But there was something about the man that unsettled Thomas. Deeply, Epstein moved with absolute confidence through the corridors as if he owned them. He brought guests always young women, always beautiful, always uncomfortable. Thomas once overheard him on a phone call in the entrance hall, discussing a delivery schedule with someone. The word choice stuck in Thomas's mind like a splinter. By summer, Thomas had documented over 70 visits. His notebook had become a compulsion, a secret mission he couldn't abandon. He told himself he was protecting the women, creating a record in case anyone ever needed proof. But proof of what? At the time, he didn't have language for what he was witnessing. It was only years later, when the Epstein case exploded across international headlines, that the pieces assembled into a coherent horror. In August, Thomas's assignment abruptly ended. He was transferred back to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace with a commendation for his service. No explanation was given. He was informed that all logs from his Windsor posting had been archived and sealed, accessible only to senior security officials. He never returned to the East Terrace entrance, but he kept the notebook. Asterisk, years passed. Thomas continued his service, rising through the ranks, earning medals and respect. He locked his notebook away and tried to forget. His daughters grew older. He attended their school plays and graduation ceremonies, always wondering if other fathers carried similar secrets, similar silences that carved hollows in their chests. In 2015, the name Jeffrey Epstein surfaced again. Thomas saw it in a newspaper while having breakfast. A brief article about a legal settlement in Florida, accusations of trafficking underage girls. Thomas set down his coffee cup with a hand that had gone numb. He went home that night and opened the safe. The notebook was exactly where he had left it, leather cover worn smooth from those months of handling. He flipped through the pages, seeing the names and dates with fresh eyes, understanding now what he had witnessed. His stomach turned. He should have reported it. He should have said something. But to whom? He had been operating under direct orders from senior security officials. The people who would receive any complaint were likely the same people who had facilitated the access. And the Official Secrets Act was absolute. Speaking publicly would mean prosecution, imprisonment, the destruction of his career and pension. His family would suffer, so Thomas did nothing. He locked the notebook away again and returned to his duties. The guilt gnawed at him like acid. In 2019, Epstein was arrested in New York. Thomas watched the news coverage with a feeling of inevitability, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 8 years. When the details emerged of the private island, the systematic abuse, the network of powerful men, he recognized the machinery. He had been a small cog in it, standing at a door, writing down times. The notebook burned in his thoughts. It contained evidence, names of women who had visited the same circles. But releasing it would accomplish what exactly? Epstein was already in custody. The case was being handled, and Thomas would destroy himself in the process. Violating laws designed to protect national security and royal privacy, then Epstein died in his cell. The news broke on a Saturday morning. Thomas was gardening when his wife called him inside to see the television. Suicide, the report said, though the circumstances immediately sparked conspiracy theories. Thomas stood in his living room, dirt still on his hands, and felt the weight of the notebook pressing on him from 2 floors above where it sat locked away. If Epstein was dead, who else knew the full truth? How many other guards, drivers, staff members had seen pieces of the same machine? How many had kept their own silent records? He began having nightmares. In them, he stood at the East Terrace entrance, while an endless line of black vehicles arrived, disgorging young women who walked past him into darkness. He tried to speak, to warn them, but no sound emerged. He woke up gasping, his wife shaking his shoulder with worry in her eyes. "You need to talk to someone," she said gently. "Whatever's bothering you." But he couldn't. The Official Secrets Act followed him even into sleep. In early 2020, Prince Andrew gave his disastrous BBC interview. Thomas watched it alone in his study, the door locked. He listened to the prince deny the allegations, claim he had no recollection of meeting Virginia Roberts, assert that the photograph must be fake. Thomas thought of the night she had arrived at 2:13 in the morning. Logged into the official registry that had since been sealed. He had been there. He had seen her. His notebook contained the exact time and date. Asterisk. Thomas retired from royal service in the spring of 2021. The ceremony was formal and respectful. He received a letter of thanks from senior officials, a small pension, and a reminder that his security clearances and obligations under the Official Secrets Act remained in effect for life. He smiled and shook hands and said all the appropriate things. On his last day, he walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace one final time, touching the walls that had defined his adult life. He thought about duty and honor, about the difference between loyalty to institution and loyalty to truth. The gap between them had become a chasm he could no longer cross. At home, he finally told his wife about the notebook. Not everything, he still couldn't violate his oaths completely, but enough. He told her about the late-night visitors, the young women, the patterns that had troubled him for years. She listened in silence, her face growing pale. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I can't destroy it. It's the only proof that any of this happened." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then keep it safe. Maybe someday it will matter." Thomas wasn't sure he believed that. The powerful had already closed ranks. Prince Andrew had stepped back from public duties but faced no criminal charges. The women's testimonies were dismissed or settled quietly. The machine had protected itself, as it always did, but he kept the notebook anyway, transferring it to a new safe with additional security measures. He made an encrypted digital copy and stored it on a hidden drive. He wrote a sealed letter explaining its contents and lodged it with a solicitor, to be opened only in the event of his death or if he gave explicit permission. Then he tried to live a normal life. He spent time with his grandchildren. He volunteered at a veterans' charity. He tended his garden and took walks and pretended that the weight had lifted. It hadn't. The guilt followed him everywhere, shadow that stretched longer as the years passed. He saw news articles about trafficking survivors, advocacy groups demanding justice, women speaking out about abuse in powerful circles. Each time, he wondered if his silence made him complicit. Each time, he touched the key to his safe and felt like a coward. In late 2022, documents from a different Epstein-related case were unsealed. Thomas read through them obsessively, searching for any mention of the Windsor visits. Any hint that someone else had come forward with similar evidence? There was nothing. The focus remained on Epstein's properties in America and the Caribbean. On the flight logs and island visitors, the East Terrace entrance at Windsor might as well have never existed. Thomas began to wonder if his memories were even real, if the years had distorted them into something larger than the truth. But then he would open the notebook and see his own handwriting, precise and measured, documenting facts without interpretation. The entries were undeniable. One afternoon, a journalist contacted him. She was researching a book about royal security protocols and wanted to interview former guards about their experiences. Thomas agreed to a brief conversation, carefully neutral in his responses. At the end, she asked casually if he had ever witnessed anything unusual during his service. The question hung in the air. Thomas felt the weight of the notebook 2 rooms away, locked and waiting. "Nothing I'm permitted to discuss," he said finally. "The Official Secrets Act, you understand." The journalist thanked him and ended the call. Thomas sat in silence afterward, wondering if he had just missed his only chance to unburden himself. But what would he have said? The evidence he possessed was fragmentary, names and times without context. And releasing it would mean prosecution, scandal. His family dragged through the media, so he said nothing. Again, asterisk by 2024. Thomas had developed a routine for managing the guilt. Every few months, he would open the safe and read through the notebook, reminding himself that the record existed, that someone remembered. It was a private ritual, almost religious in its regularity. But something was shifting in the broader culture. More survivors were speaking out. More institutions were being held accountable. The wall of silence that had protected powerful abusers for decades was developing cracks. Thomas began to wonder if his moment of relevance might eventually arrive. He started following advocacy organizations, reading about trauma-informed investigation practices, learning the language of institutional abuse that he hadn't possessed during his years of service. The patterns he had documented fit perfectly into frameworks that experts now described: grooming, trafficking networks, the exploitation of access and power. His notebook wasn't just a personal record. It was evidence of a system. One evening, Thomas sat down with his adult daughters and told them a version of his story. He didn't reveal specific names or dates, but he explained that he had witnessed something troubling during his service, something that still haunted him. He asked them what they thought he should do. His eldest daughter, a human rights lawyer, looked at him with careful eyes. "Dad," she said gently, "you need to understand that if you come forward now, it will consume your life. The legal battles, the media attention, the attacks on your credibility. You need to be prepared for that." His younger daughter, a teacher, added quietly, "But if you don't, you'll carry this forever." And those women deserve to have their experiences acknowledged, even if it's just in a notebook someone finally reads. Thomas nodded slowly. They were both right, and both perspectives were impossible to reconcile. In early 2025, a new investigation was announced. International authorities were collaborating to trace the full extent of Epstein's network, seeking evidence that might implicate others who had escaped accountability. The news mentioned specifically that investigators were interested in hearing from any witnesses who had information about visits to properties or meetings in Europe. Thomas read the article 3 times. Then he opened his safe and looked at the notebook. The leather cover was cracked now, aged by years of hiding. Inside, the pages held the names of young women who deserved better than his silence. But the Official Secrets Act was still in effect. Speaking to foreign investigators without permission would be a criminal offense. He would need to go through official channels, which meant reporting to the same institutional structures that had facilitated the assassins in the first place. Thomas contacted a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protections. The consultation was careful and preliminary. The lawyer explained that the Official Secrets Act did contain provisions for reporting serious crimes, that the process was complex and the outcomes uncertain. Thomas would need to be prepared for the possibility of prosecution, even if his intentions were honorable.
How
serious are the crimes you witnessed? The lawyer asked. Thomas thought about the young faces, the late hours, the systematic pattern that had operated with institutional approval. Serious enough that I've kept records for 13 years, he said. Asterisk, the lawyer made notes and promised to research his options. Thomas left the office feeling both relieved and terrified. He had taken the first step toward breaking his silence, but the path ahead remained unclear. That night, Thomas returned home and did something he hadn't done in years. He read through the entire notebook from beginning to end, every entry, every detail he had recorded during those months at the East Terrace entrance. The cumulative weight of it was staggering. Over 100 documented visits, dozens of young women, a pattern so consistent it could only have been coordinated at the highest levels. Some of the entries made him pause. He had noted things at the time without understanding their significance. Overheard phone conversations, repeated vehicle registrations, correlations between Epstein's visits, and the subsequent arrival of the young women. Viewed as a whole, the evidence painted a devastating picture of institutional complicity. Thomas realized that his notebook wasn't just about Prince Andrew or Jeffrey Epstein. It was about a security apparatus that had facilitated access, about staff who had been ordered to look the other way, about a culture of silence that protected reputation over truth. He had been part of that culture, and his documentation was both evidence against it and proof of his own moral failure to intervene. The question now was whether revealing it would serve any purpose beyond his own conscience. The women whose names appeared in his pages had their own agency, their own decisions to make about coming forward or remaining private. Did Thomas have the right to expose their visits without their consent, even in pursuit of accountability? He called the lawyer back the next morning with a different question. If I were to provide this evidence through proper channels, could it be done in a way that protects the identities of the women involved? The lawyer was quiet for a moment. Potentially, she said carefully, but you need to understand that once you hand over documentation to any authority, you lose control of how it's used. Even with redactions, patterns can be traced. People can be identified. Thomas thanked her and ended the call. He sat at his kitchen table, the notebook open in front of him, and tried to imagine each of the women he had documented. Where were they now? Had they healed, moved on, built lives that didn't include those late-night visits? Or were they still trapped in the aftermath, still seeking acknowledgement and justice? He couldn't know, and that uncertainty paralyzed him. Days turned into weeks. The notebook remained on his desk, no longer hidden, but not yet revealed. Thomas existed in a state of suspension, unable to move forward or backward. His wife watched him with growing concern. "You're going to make yourself ill?" she said one evening. "Whatever you decide, you need to decide soon." Thomas knew she was right. The waiting was worse than any outcome would be. That night, he finally wrote a letter to the investigating authorities, explaining in general terms that he possessed documentation related to visitors at royal residences during the relevant time period. He didn't reveal specifics, but he offered to provide the information through appropriate legal channels if they could. Guarantee protection for both himself and the individuals documented. He sealed the letter, but didn't mail it. Instead, he placed it in the safe alongside the notebook. A decision deferred once again, but something had changed. By writing the letter, by articulating his willingness to come forward, Thomas had crossed an internal threshold. The silence was no longer absolute. It had become conditional, temporary, a choice he was actively making rather than a cage he was trapped inside. He began sleeping better. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely, but they lost some of their suffocating weight. He started talking more openly with his daughters about accountability and courage, about the difference between legal obligation and moral imperative, and he waited, not passively anymore, but actively watching for the right moment, the right avenue, the alignment of circumstances that might allow the truth to emerge without destroying everyone it touched. The notebook remained in his safe, pages filled with the ghosts of late-night visitors and the machinery of power that had welcomed them. Whether those pages would ever see daylight, whether the names and dates would ever serve as evidence rather than simply guilt, Thomas still didn't know, but he had stopped pretending he would burn them. The title he had written on the first page years ago, in a moment of dark humor, remained. The Epstein files I couldn't burn. They were his burden and his testimony, his failure and his witness. And until he found the courage or the path to release them properly, they would remain exactly where they were, locked away, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. Outside his window, life continued its ordinary rhythms. But Thomas Hartley carried his secret still, waiting for the moment when silence would finally cost more than truth.